They gave her the land nobody wanted, 40 acres of cracked earth at the end of a dirt road where the grass had given up and the well had gone dry sometime before anyone bothered to notice. No house worth living in, no neighbor within shouting distance, nothing but silence, dust, and a rusted fence that leaned the wrong way in the wind. She stood there with one bag of clothes and listened to the nothing. They had laughed when the lawyer read her name. Not out loud, people like that never laugh out loud. They do it with their eyes, with the corners of their mouths, with the way they suddenly find something interesting to look at on the ceiling. At least you have somewhere to fall, Clara. That's what her mother-in-law had said. And maybe she was right, maybe this was the bottom. But here is what they didn't know about Clara Sutton, what 45 years of being underestimated had quietly built inside her beneath the grief, beneath the humiliation, beneath the dust settling on her shoes. She had never once in her life stayed down. She picked up her bag, she walked toward the broken door, and somewhere beneath 30 years of hard dead earth, though she didn't know it yet, something was still alive. It was waiting for her. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and central air conditioning set too cold for the season. Clara Sutton sat in a chair against the wall, not at the table, not among the family, against the wall, the way you sit when you already know you don't belong in the room. It was August in Red Rock, Texas. Outside, the heat pressed against the windows like something alive. Inside, 14 members of the Sutton family arranged themselves around the long conference table
The
as if
secret
they
to a
had
good
rehearsed
harvest
the
isn't
seeding
just the
chart
water
in
or the sun,
advance.
Clara.
Maybe
It's
they
tending
had.
to the soil,
Virginia
believing
Sutton,
in the
Earl's
growth
mother,
even
sat
when you
at the
can't
head
see it yet.
position nearest the
These are for
lawyer's
you,
desk,
Clara.
her back straight, her
Grow
hands
something
folded, her
beautiful.
expression the
I
particular
will.
kind of neutral
They
that
mean a lot
takes
to me.
years of practice to
My mama sent me to help with
manufacture.
the fence.
Clara wore the same black dress she had worn to the
Well, thank
funeral
you,
3 weeks
Jessie.
earlier. It was
That's
the
a good
only black dress
start.
she owned. She had washed it twice since then and hung it to dry in the small bathroom of her mother-in-law's house where she had been staying since Earl died, sleeping in the guest room with the floral wallpaper and the window that didn't open all the way. Nobody had asked her to leave yet. Nobody had asked her to stay either. The lawyer's name was Hartwell. He was a thin man in his late 50s with reading glasses. He kept taking off and putting back on as if the documents in front of him kept changing their meaning. He had a way of clearing his throat before each new item that made Clara think of someone preparing to deliver bad news at regular intervals, which was, she supposed, exactly what he was doing. He began with the house. The Sutton family home, 4 bedrooms, 2 acres of land on the respectable side of Red Rock, the house where Earl had grown up and where Virginia had lived for 40 years, went to Earl's older brother Clifton. Clifton nodded as if this confirmed something he had already been told, which it probably had. The cattle and the grazing land on the east property went to Earl's younger brother Dwight. Dwight wrote something down in a small notebook. He had been writing things down since the meeting started. Clara watched him and thought about all the years she had sat at Sunday dinners in that house, passing dishes and asking questions and genuinely trying to be part of something that had never once opened its doors all the way to let her in. The money in the savings account, nearly $40,000 that Clara had known about and assumed in the vague and trusting way of someone who believes a marriage is a partnership would be shared, was divided among Earl's 3 nephews for their education. The truck went to Clifton's oldest son. The tools in the garage went to Dwight. The furniture, the china, the silver flatware that had been a wedding gift, the riding mower, the generator. Each item had a name attached to it, and none of those names were Clara. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened. She had been married to Earl Sutton for 19 years. She had cooked his meals and kept his house and worked part-time at the hardware store in town because he had asked her to help with expenses, though somehow the expenses always managed to consume everything she made and leave nothing behind. She had believed in the way that people believe things they need to believe to get through ordinary days, that the marriage was imperfect but real, that she mattered, that the years meant something The lawyer cleared his throat. He turned a page. And for his wife, Teresa Clara Sutton, the lawyer used her full name, which almost nobody did, which made it sound like a stranger. The property situated at the end of Route 9 in the unincorporated area east of Red Rock, commonly referred to as the Thorn Acre, 40 acres, deeded solely to the surviving spouse. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then Earl's brother Dwight made a sound that was not quite a laugh, the kind of sound a man makes when he is trying to suppress something and not trying very hard. The Thornaker, he said quietly, almost to himself, like a man reading a punchline he had already heard. Virginia Sutton did not look at Clara, she looked at the window. But her mouth did something, a small compression, a satisfaction held carefully between the lips that Clara saw and understood completely. At least you have somewhere to fall, Clara. That's what Virginia said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just that the way you state an obvious fact about the weather. Clara did not respond. She looked at the lawyer's desk and breathed through her nose and held everything she was feeling in the place behind her sternum, where she had learned over 19 years to store things that had nowhere else to go. Hartwell continued. He was reading the final provisions, the small details, the legal language that meant the meeting was nearly over. Clara was already thinking about where she would sleep that night, whether she could stay one more week in the floral wallpaper room, whether Virginia would let her, or whether this meeting had officially ended, whatever thin courtesy had extended that invitation. She was thinking about this when the lawyer stood to collect signatures. He moved around the table efficiently, placing documents in front of each family member, pointing to signature lines. When he reached Clara, he set a single page in front of her, the acknowledgement that she had received her inheritance, and as he placed the pen beside it, he did something that nobody else in the room seemed to notice. He pressed a small envelope into her hand. It was the size of a business card, sealed, her name written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize, old handwriting, the kind of careful cursive that belonged to a different generation. He met her eyes for just a moment and gave the smallest possible shake of his head, which she understood to mean not here. She closed her fingers around it. She signed the document. She was reading the name on the envelope, the return name in that same careful cursive, when Virginia appeared at her elbow. The older woman's hand came down on Clara's wrist with a grip that was firm and familiar and cold. "That's a family document," Virginia said. "I'll take that." It happened in 3 seconds. Virginia's fingers on her wrist, the envelope lifted away, Virginia turning and walking back toward Clifton with the smooth efficiency of someone exercising a right they have never once doubted. Clara looked at the lawyer. He was already looking away, gathering papers, his face carefully empty. Clara had seen the name on the envelope. Just the name, nothing else, before Virginia took it. Henry Pruitt. She didn't know who that was. She had never heard Earl mention the name. But she held it in her mind the way you hold a key when you don't yet know which door it opens, carefully without squeezing too hard. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the office into the Texas August heat and did not look back. The drive to the Thorn Acre took most of a day. She had no car of her own. Earl's truck had gone to Clifton's Sun before the ink was dry, and so she took the Greyhound as far as the bus would go, which was a gas station 2 towns east of Red Rock called Mineral Stop. And then she stood on the shoulder of the highway with her canvas bag and her one good pair of boots and waited. The man who stopped was named Garrett Oakes. He drove a flatbed delivery truck with a cracked dashboard and a pine tree air freshener that had long since stopped smelling like pine. He was going east anyway, he said. He didn't ask many questions, which Clara appreciated more than she could have explained at that moment. He had a thermos of coffee he offered without ceremony, and she accepted it the same way, and they drove for a while without talking while the landscape outside changed. It changed slowly, the way things change in West Texas, not dramatically but steadily, like a dial being turned down. The green faded first. The trees thinned and disappeared, replaced by mesquite and scrub cedar that crouched low against the earth as if bracing for something. The soil went from dark brown to reddish clay to a pale cracked gray that looked less like earth and more like something left behind after the earth had given up and moved on. Garrett turned off the highway onto Route 9, which was paved for the first 3 miles and then wasn't. The truck moved slower on the dirt road, raising a column of red dust behind them. On either side, the land stretched flat and wide and indifferent in all directions, and there was a quality to the silence out here that was different from the silence in Red Rock, different from any silence Clara had experienced before. It was not peaceful. It was the silence of absence of things that used to be there and weren't anymore. He slowed to a stop. "This is the boundary marker," he said. "Right there, that post." Clara looked. A concrete post at the edge of the road, old, leaning slightly, with the number of the deed painted on it in letters that had faded to almost nothing. Beyond it, a wire fence that had collapsed in at least 4 places. Beyond that, the property. She got out of the truck. She stood and looked. The house was 60 yards from the road, visible through the collapsed fence and the scrub. It had been built from wood that had once been painted white, though almost nothing of the paint remained. The roof sagged on one side where a rafter had given way. One window had no glass. The door hung at an angle from a single hinge, open to whatever wanted to come in: wind, animals, weather time. In front of the house, the yard was nothing but packed earth and rock. No trees, no shade, not a single growing thing. Behind it, what should have been cultivatable land was a tangle of dry brush and thorned mesquite and brittle grass that snapped when the wind moved through it. The fence that had once enclosed the rear acreage lay on the ground in sections, rusted and half buried by the dirt that blew across it year after year. There was a well. Clara could see it from the road, a concrete cylinder capped with rotted wooden boards in the middle of the yard, surrounded by nothing. Garrett Oakes stayed in the truck for a moment. Then he leaned out the window. "You really going to stay?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said. He looked at the house for a while. He rubbed the back of his neck. "There might still be a well," he said finally, like a man who has decided that if he can find one true and useful thing to say, he will say it. "Worth checking before you haul water from somewhere else." "Thank you," Clara said, "for the ride, for the coffee." He nodded. He put the truck in gear. She watched it go down Route 9, the red dust rising and then settling, rising and then settling until the truck was gone, and there was only the road and the land and the sound of the wind moving through the thorned brush with a dry, papery sound like old pages turning. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the broken door. The first night she slept on the floor because there was nothing else to sleep on. The room that must have once served as a bedroom contained only a rusted bed frame, no mattress, and a scatter of old straw in one corner that might have been a mattress a very long time ago. She laid her canvas bag on the floor and used her jacket as a pillow and lay down in the darkness and listened to the building breathe. It breathed in a specific way all structures do, a settling and creaking and the occasional sharp tick of wood contracting in the cooling night air. The roof, where it was damaged, led in a panel of sky, and she could see stars through the gap, more stars than she had seen in years, more stars than she had thought were actually there, a density of light that seemed both enormous and somehow intimate, like being spoken to in a language you don't know but can almost understand. She did not sleep for a long time. She thought about the room in Virginia's house with its floral wallpaper. She thought about 19 years. She thought about the names in the will that were not her name and the quiet collective satisfaction in that room of people who had never looked at her directly when they could avoid it. She thought about the envelope Virginia had taken, the name written in careful old cursive, Henry Pruitt. She thought about the lawyer's eyes when he had pressed it into her hand, the small shake of his head, not a warning, more like an apology. She did not cry that night. She had expected to and was vaguely surprised when the feeling that moved through her was not grief, but something harder and quieter, something that sat in the chest like a stone and did not dissolve. She lay under the gap in the roof and looked at the stars and made a single promise to herself, the kind of promise you make in the dark that you know you will either keep forever or never mention again. She would not go back. Whatever this place was, whatever it took, she would not go back to that house and that room and that particular quality of being invisible in a room full of people who knew her name. She spent the first 3 days doing what could be done with no tools, no money, and 2 hands. She swept the floors with a branch torn from a mesquite outside, moving the dust and the animal droppings and the generations of debris toward the door and out into the yard. She found 3 rusted cans behind the house and used them to haul water from a narrow creek she discovered after an hour of walking. The property's edge, the creek was a mile and a half away, technically beyond her boundary, but the water was there and she was thirsty and she carried what she could carry and made the walk twice a day, morning and evening, her feet raising small puffs of dust with each step on the hard-pan road. She boarded the broken window with a piece of rotted wood she found in the brush, wedging it into the frame so that at least the wind would have to work harder to get in. She found wire in the collapsed fence and used it to rehang the doors so that it closed. Not well, but closed. She ate what she had brought, canned beans, a bag of rice she cooked on a fire she built in the yard from mesquite wood, a few apples that were getting soft. She sat outside in the evenings and watched the sky go from blue to orange to a deep arterial red before the darkness came, and she noticed that the darkness here was not like darkness in a town, not the partial darkness of street lights and passing cars and the ambient glow of a civilization nearby. This darkness was complete. It had weight and texture and it pressed in from all directions, and the only sounds in it were the wind and whatever moved in the brush and very occasionally something she couldn't identify a note, almost something between a creak and a tone that might have been the land itself adjusting to the temperature. It should have been frightening. It wasn't. Or if it was, the fear was smaller than something else that was also there, something she couldn't quite name yet, something that felt like the first faint outline of a thing that hadn't existed for a long time. On the 4th morning, she found the note the lawyer had given her. She hadn't forgotten it, but she had been busy, and there was something about it she wasn't ready for, the knowledge that there was information she didn't have yet, that the ground beneath her was less solid than it appeared. She found it folded into the inside pocket of her jacket, the pocket she never used, and she sat down on the front step of the house and opened it. The paper was the kind that comes inside a greeting card, small cream colored with a watermark she didn't recognize. The handwriting was the same careful cursive she had seen on the outside of the envelope before Virginia took it. But this paper had been there all along, separate from the envelope pressed against the jacket lining. Hartwell had given her both. She read what it said. The spring is still alive. Don't let them have it. I tried to set things right, but I ran out of time. The land remembers. You will understand when you find the box. Below the message was a name, Henry Pruitt, and a year 2016. Clara read it twice. She looked at the land in front of her, the cracked earth, the collapsed fence, the dry brush going onto the horizon in every direction. She thought about the word spring, and she thought about the word box, and she thought about a man who had died 8 years ago, leaving a message for a woman he had never met, a woman who would inherit this land that everyone considered worthless. She folded the paper carefully and put it back in her jacket. She went inside. She found it on the 5th day. She had been working along the back wall of the house, the interior wall, trying to determine whether the foundation was solid enough to trust or whether the whole structure was a slow-motion collapse she was living inside. She was checking for rot, pressing her fingers into the lower portions of the wall where moisture would have collected over years of neglect. And the floor near the base of the wall was not dirt, but something harder under the dirt, something that had been covered deliberately. She cleared the top layer of soil with her hands. Packed earth, then a wooden board, then beneath it set into the ground with the kind of care that implies intent, a tin box, about the size of a shoebox, sealed at the seams with something that might once have been wax and had hardened to a brown crust over the decades. She carried it outside into the daylight. She sat in the dirt with it in her lap. It took her several minutes and a piece of wire to pry the seal open without destroying the box, and when she finally lifted the lid, the smell that rose from it was something she had no word for. Not the smell of rot, not the smell of mold, something older and drier than either. The smell of a time that had been sealed away and had not changed the smell of something preserved. Inside small cloth pouches tied with twine, each one labeled in handwriting identical to the letter tomato, sweet corn, pole bean, butternut, squash, okra. Each pouch held seeds dry, intact, lightweight in the palm, seeds that had been wrapped in cloth and placed in a sealed tin with deliberate care. Under the pouches, a single folded piece of paper. She opened it. It was a letter. The handwriting was the same, but the date was different. Not 2016, but 1986, nearly 40 years ago. To whoever finds this place after me, I have farmed this land for 22 years. This soil is not dead. It has never been dead. The water is still here underground, the same water my father's father used. It needs clearing to find, but it is there. I am leaving these seeds because they have been good to us, and I believe they will be good to whoever comes next. Plant them near the water. Be patient. The land will answer. Whatever they tell you about this place, whoever they are, don't believe it. There is nothing wrong with this land that a little faith won't fix. Henry Pruitt, 1986. Clara sat in the yard with the letter in her hands and the seeds in their cloth pouches arranged in the dirt beside her, and the morning sun came up over the flat edge of the land and hit her face with a warmth that was different from the punishing heat of midday, a warmth that still had gentleness in it, and she breathed. Henry Pruitt, the same name on the note from 2016. The same handwriting, older and shakier in the later version. A man who had planted seeds here and believed in this land for decades and left messages for someone he would never meet. She looked at the seeds. She looked at the land. She went to find water. It took her the rest of that day and most of the following morning. The creek, a mile and a half out, was too far for practical irrigation. She understood that already from 3 days of hauling. What Henry's letter described was something on the property itself, underground, something that needed clearing to find. She walked every acre she could identify as hers, moving in slow parallel lines from east to west and then north to south, crouching to press her palm against the earth every 20 yards, looking for the specific quality of difference that meant moisture below the surface. She found nothing the first day. She walked until her feet were raw inside her boots, and the sun had moved across the sky and started its descent, and she sat against the one rock formation of any size on the property and admitted to herself that she was exhausted and discouraged and that the crack in her certainty was getting wider. But she came back the following morning. She was working the northeastern corner of the property, the farthest point from the house, an area choked with thorn brush she had to push through with her arms raised to keep them from her face when she heard it. Not water, not yet. Sound. Bird song. A specific liquid kind of bird song coming from a cluster of larger rocks, perhaps 50 yards ahead, rocks she hadn't reached yet because the brush was densest there. She pushed through. The rocks were granite, roughly the size of pickup trucks, stacked in a natural formation that had probably been there since before anyone in Texas had thought to put a fence around anything. Moss grew on the north faces of the rocks, green living moss in the middle of land that had nothing green anywhere, and between the rocks in the narrow channel where two of them met the earth, the soil was darker. visibly unmistakably darker. She got on her knees. She pressed both hands flat against the earth. It was cool, not air cool, earth cool, the specific coolness of ground with moisture beneath it. She dug with her fingers, pushing through the first hard layer, and the soil underneath was different, darker, denser, clumping together rather than crumbling away. She dug deeper. Her fingers hit something that was not rock. She cleared the loose earth away from a natural crevice in the base of the largest rock. The surface of the crevice was dark with moisture. She used a stick to work deeper into it, and the earth gave way easily now, and she heard before she saw it the sound of water. Not rushing, not even flowing really, more like breathing. A thin, persistent movement of water through stone, barely more than a seep, but water clear, water moving alive. She put her hand in. Cold, clean, the kind of cold that comes from deep in the ground, from far below the surface where the temperature doesn't change with the seasons. She cupped her hands and drank. The water tasted like stone and mineral and something deeper, something she didn't have a word for. It tasted like a promise that had been kept without anyone around to witness the keeping of it. She sat beside it for a long time. She walked to the town of Crockett the next morning. It was 7 miles on foot, and it took her 2.5 hours in the early heat, and by the time she arrived, her shirt was dark with sweat, and her feet had the specific ache of someone who has been walking on hard ground in boots not designed for distance. She went to the hardware store first. She had $23 in her wallet, which was what remained after the bus ticket, and she spent 11 of it on a hatchet, a coil of wire, and a small trowel. She was standing outside the hardware store figuring out how to carry the coil of wire the 7 miles back when she noticed the yard next door. It was a small yard attached to a small house at the edge of the commercial block, and in it a woman of perhaps 68 was moving between raised beds with the specific purposeful slowness of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and is not in a hurry because they've learned that hurry doesn't help. The beds were producing visibly abundantly tomatoes, peppers, something leafy and dark. In this town, on this soil, in this heat, Clara stood at the fence. The woman looked up. Her name was Edna Hollis. She had been widowed 11 years ago. She mentioned this without self-pity, the way you mention weather. She had farmed this small patch in Crockett for 30 years, and before that had farmed with her husband on a larger property east of town that they'd eventually lost, which she also mentioned without self-pity, though this time Clara noticed something brief and controlled move across the woman's face before it settled back to neutral. Edna made coffee on a propane burner in the kitchen, and they sat at a wooden table that had been repaired so many times its surface was a record of different woods and different decades. And she talked about soil with the directness of someone accustomed to speaking only when they have something worth saying. Good soil isn't pretty soil, she said. People think good soil looks nice. It doesn't. Good soil looks alive. Good soil is near water and has things decomposing in it and has been turned enough that it's got air in it. That's all. You can make that happen anywhere you have water. Clara told her about the spring. Edna was quiet for a moment. She looked at Clara with a steadiness that felt like being assessed, not unkindly, but honestly. "You're at the Thorn Acre," Edna said. "That's not a question." "Yes," Clara said. Edna nodded slowly. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "Henry Pruitt's land," she said. "Before it was Sutton land." The name hit Clara in the chest, though she kept her face still. "You knew Henry Pruitt," she said. "Everybody out this way knew Henry," Edna said. "Good man, stubborn as a fence post and twice as reliable. He farmed that land 40 years, raised a family on it until he lost it." She paused. "Lost it wrong. That's all I'll say about that." Clara wanted to ask more. She held the questions back for now. "Come back next week," Edna said when Clara stood to leave. "I'll teach you about root depth and timing." She paused at the door. "You've got the look of someone who's going to be there in the morning regardless, so you might as well do it right." She pressed the paper bag into Clara's hands. tomato seedlings wrapped in damp newspaper, 6 of them. Plant these near the water, she said, not too close, 3 feet back from the source. Clara walked home in the afternoon heat with the seedlings and the coil of wire and the hatchet and the trowel and $11 in her pocket, and somewhere in the middle of the second mile she realized that the weight of everything she was carrying was not the weight of too much, but the weight of enough, the specific and different weight of purpose. She was clearing brush near the spring the following afternoon when she heard the voice. "Excuse me, ma'am, can I help?" She turned. He was standing at the collapsed fence line, a boy of about 11, thin, in the way of children who don't eat quite enough, wearing a faded green t-shirt and shorts and no shoes. His feet on the hard ground looked tough and accustomed to it. He was holding a rusted piece of fencing he had apparently picked up from the ground nearby, and he was looking at her with an expression that was careful and serious and something else she couldn't immediately name. "Why," Clara said. He shrugged with one shoulder. "Just passing," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She had learned over years of living in a house where attention was a resource distributed unequally to read what wasn't being said, and what wasn't being said by this boy was quite a lot. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jessie," he said. And then after a brief pause, "Jessie Pruitt." She held that name in the same careful way she had held Henry Pruitt's, gently without squeezing. "You know how to work, Jessie Pruitt?" she asked. He nodded once. "Then come through the fence," she said, "and bring that wire with you." He worked beside her for the rest of the afternoon without talking much, which suited her. He was efficient, she noticed, with the efficiency of someone who has learned to conserve effort, because effort is a resource like any other. He pulled brush and cleared rock and helped her move the larger stones away from the spring's natural channel without being asked twice about anything. When the work required coordination, he was attentive and quick. When it didn't, he was quiet. At the end of the day, she cooked the rice on the outdoor fire and split it between 2 tin cups and handed one to him, and he ate with the focused speed of someone not certain when the next meal would arrive. "You can come back tomorrow if you want," she said. He looked at the garden area where they had cleared and staked and begun the rough outline of what might become something. He looked at the spring, its small, clear movement visible now that the brush had been cleared from around the rocks. "Okay," he said, "and then my sister might want to come too. She's 8. "That's fine," Clara said. He nodded. He walked back to the fence line in the long late light, and she watched him go, this boy with his grandfather's name, and she said nothing about that yet. That evening, as the dark came in and the fire burned down to coals, she heard a vehicle on Route 9 slowing. She didn't go inside. She stood in the yard and watched the road. A late model pickup truck, the expensive kind, the kind that has never been used to actually haul anything, moved slowly along the road outside her fence line, not stopping, just moving slowly the way a vehicle moves when the person inside is looking carefully at something. It slowed almost to a stop at the boundary marker. Then it drove on. She watched the taillights disappear in the direction of town. That night, before the darkness was complete, her phone rang. It was Edna. Edna's voice had something different in it, something compressed and careful, like a person choosing their words with more deliberateness than usual. "I heard Frank Dolan was driving out on Route 9 this evening," Edna said. Clara said nothing, waiting. "I want you to understand something about Frank Dolan," Edna said. "He owns a lot of land out this way, has for decades, and there's a creek that runs through the northeastern corner of your property, the same creek that feeds the water table under his east pasture." She paused. "Frank's son, a boy named Thomas, drowned in a flash flood on that creek in 2014. He was 19 years old. Frank has never recovered from that. Not in the way people usually mean when they say that. He recovered in the way that made him want to own the thing that hurt him, to control it, to dam it up and make it harmless." Clara stood in the yard with the phone pressed to her ear and the coals of the fire going gray. nearby. He wants to buy the watershed, Edna said. He's been trying to acquire the land around that creek system for 10 years. Your spring is part of it. The Thorn Acre is right in the middle of it. And Clara, she paused again. Men like Frank Dolan don't ask twice. The first time he comes is the polite time. Clara looked at the road where the taillights had disappeared. Thank you for telling me, she said. After she hung up, she stood in the yard for a long time. The stars were enormous overhead. The wind moved through the thorned brush with its dry, papery sound. Somewhere in the northeastern corner of the property, beneath the granite rocks, where two large stones met the earth, the spring moved through its ancient channel in the dark, doing what it had always done, indifferent to everything above it. She thought about a man named Frank Dolan who had lost his son to a creek and had spent 10 years trying to own the thing that had taken him. She thought about a man named Henry Pruitt who had farmed this land for 40 years and lost it wrong. She thought about a boy named Jesse who had showed up at her fence line with his grandfather's name and his grandfather's eyes and had eaten rice from a tin cup with the speed of someone not sure when the next meal was coming. She thought about 19 years in a house where she had never quite belonged, and a room with floral wallpaper and a voice saying, "At least you have somewhere to fall." She looked at the land around her, cracked and dry and difficult, and hers. She went inside. She did not lock the door, but she started thinking about what it would mean in the days ahead to have to. The first tomato came up on a Tuesday. Clara almost missed it. She was moving along the row she had staked out near the spring, checking soil moisture by pressing 2 fingers an inch into the earth, the way Edna had shown her when she saw it, a small green curl pushing up through the dark soil, no bigger than a thumbnail, tender and almost translucent in the morning light. She crouched down and looked at it for a long moment without touching it. It was the first living thing she had caused to exist in this place. She sat back on her heels and felt something move through her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. Not happiness exactly. Something more fundamental than happiness. Something closer to confirmation. She went back to work. Jesse came every morning now, arriving at the fence line before 7, with Lily behind him, his 8-year-old sister, who was quieter than Jesse and watched everything with large, serious eyes that missed nothing. Lily didn't talk much, but she worked with a focused attention that was remarkable in a child her age, crouching over seedlings with her small hands moving carefully, pulling weeds by the root rather than the stem, because Jessie had shown her that pulling by the stem just broke the surface and left the root to grow back. Clara watched the two of them working together in the early morning light and thought about the word family without letting herself think it too directly, the way you approach something fragile. Within 3 weeks, the garden had taken on a shape. The tomato seedlings Edna had given her were knee-high and beginning to flower. The pole beans she had grown from Henry Pruitt's seeds had found the wire trellis she had built and were climbing with a purposeful spiraling energy. 2 rows of sweet corn stood along the eastern edge of the cleared area, shorter than she wanted but green and strong. Near the house she had planted the butternut squash, and they had spread across the ground with a lush, territorial confidence, their broad leaves collecting the morning dew and holding it longer than anything else in the garden. The spring, once she had properly cleared and channeled it, produced enough flow to fill a 10-gallon tank twice a day. Not abundance, not yet, but enough. But she slept better now. Not well, there was too much to think about for real. Sleep, too many calculations running in the back of her mind about water and soil, and the fence that still needed proper repair, and the roof section that would not survive another hard rain. But the quality of her restlessness had changed. It was the restlessness of someone building something rather than the restlessness of someone falling. She sold for the first time on a Saturday morning in late September. Edna had told her about the market in Crockett, a small weekly gathering in the parking lot of the old feed store on Main Street, a dozen or so vendors setting up folding tables and truck tailgates starting at 7 in the morning. Clara borrowed a folding table from Edna, loaded what she had into a cardboard box, and caught a ride into town with a rancher named Shelby Greer who passed Route 9 on his way in. She had tomatoes, red, firm, heavy, green beans from Henry Seeds, 1.5 pounds of them, 3 butternut squash, the first to mature each one, a solid dark gold, and 6 bunches of the okra she had grown from the last of the seed pouches caught that morning while the dew was still on them. She set up her table at the edge of the market and waited. The first customer was a woman in her 50s who picked up a tomato and held it with the attention of someone who knows what a real tomato feels like and has not felt one in a while. She bought 4 of them without bargaining. The second customer bought all the okra. By 9 o'clock, the table was half empty, and Clara had made $63, which was more than she had held in her hand at one time since leaving the Sutton house. She stood behind her empty table at 10:30 when everything was sold, and the money was folded in her pocket, and the morning felt large and clear around her, and she experienced something she had to work to identify because it had been absent long enough to feel unfamiliar. She felt proud, not triumphant, not vindicated, just quietly, solidly proud, the way you feel when a thing you weren't sure you could do turns out to be something you can do. She spent $20 of the 63 on hardware, wire nails, 2 hinges for the door that still wasn't hanging right, and the rest she put away. She walked home. It was Edna who told her 2 weeks later that Frank Dolan had come to the market the previous Saturday. He hadn't bought anything. He had walked through once, slowly, hands in his pockets, looking at the produce on the tables with an expression that Edna described as a man doing an inventory of something he considered already his. He had stopped at the space where Clara's table had been. She hadn't been there that week. The squash weren't ready, and looked at the empty spot for a moment before moving on. Clara was weeding the bean row when Edna told her this. She kept weeding. He came to the property last week too, she said. Drove past twice on Tuesday. Didn't stop. Edna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he's going to come to you directly. It's only a matter of time. When he does, don't let him see you flinch. I won't, Clara said. Edna looked at her steadily. I know you think you won't, she said. He's a practice man, Clara. He's been doing this a long time and he's good at it. Just remember what you have and what it's worth. Don't let him be the one who defines that for you. Frank Dolan came on a Wednesday morning 3 days later. He came in the expensive pickup truck, and this time he pulled up to the fence line and got out. 2 men got out with him from the passenger side. Clara was in the garden with Jessie when she heard the truck door close, and she stood up and turned and looked. Frank Dolan was 65 years old, built with the particular solidity of a man who had worked hard in his youth and now carried the weight of decades of good meals and authority in equal measure. He wore a rancher's hat and good boots and a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he moved to the fence line with the deliberate ease of someone accustomed to the world rearranging itself around his arrival. The 2 men with him stayed a step behind. One of them was older, perhaps 50, with a rancher's face. The other was younger, with the quality of stillness that Clara associated with men who were being paid to stand somewhere and look like they were capable of more than standing. Clara walked to the fence. They looked at each other through the wire. So you're Earl Sutton's widow, Frank said. His voice was the kind of voice that assumed it would be listened to. That's right, Clara said. He looked past her at the garden, at the cornrows, the tomato plants, the squash spread across the ground. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's calculating rather than seeing. You've done some work out here, he said. There was no admiration in it. It was a fact being logged. I have, Clara said. He took off his hat, pressed one hand through his hair, put the hat back on. A gesture that managed to be both casual and deliberate. I'm going to be straight with you, he said. I've been trying to acquire the land around this creek system for a while now. Your property sits in the middle of it. I'd like to buy it from you. It's not for sale, Clara said. Something moved in his face, not anger, something quieter than anger, something more like the careful noting of an unexpected obstacle. He had a number ready. He said it. It was not a large number. It was the number you offer someone you believe to be in a weak position, a number large enough to seem reasonable and small enough to confirm the assessment. That would set you up in a house in town, he said. Easier life than this. Clara looked at the garden she had built, at the spring she had found, at Jessie, who had stopped working and was standing very still near the bean trellis watching. I'm not looking for an easier life, she said. I'm looking for mine. Frank Dolan's expression settled into something that was not quite patience and not quite its opposite, a controlled flatness, the face of a man suspending a decision. You don't know this land, he said. You haven't been here long enough to know what you're dealing with. I know there's water on it, Clara said. I know the soil near that water grows things. I know it grew things for the family that was here before mine. The name Pruitt landed in the air between them without her saying it, but she felt it there, and she saw something change briefly in Frank Dolan's eyes before the flatness covered it again. He looked at her for a long moment. Think about it, he said, as if she had asked for time rather than refused him. He turned and walked back to the truck. The older man followed. The younger one held Clara's gaze for a second longer than was necessary before he turned, and in that second she understood clearly that the message was not in what Frank had said, but in that second of held eye contact in the presence of the second man at all. The truck drove away. Jessie came to stand beside her at the fence line. That was Frank Dolan, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Clara said. Jessie looked at the road where the truck had gone. His jaw was set in a way that looked too old for his face. He's not going to stop, he said quietly. I know, Clara said. She went back to the garden. 3 nights later, she found the cross. She had gone to bed early, tired from a full day of digging a secondary channel from the spring to extend the reach of the irrigation, and she had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when something pulled her up out of sleep with the sudden total alertness of someone whose body has heard something before their mind caught up. She lay still and listened. Wind, the creak of the repaired door in its frame, the scrub brush moving in the dark. Then headlights through the repaired window, sweeping slowly, casting moving shadows across the interior wall of the room. She got up, she went to the window and looked through the gap between the board and the frame. A vehicle was moving slowly down Route 9, not pulling in, just moving past the property line very slowly, the lights illuminating the fence and the scrub and the front of the house in a slow sweep. It stopped. A figure got out, tall male hat, moving to the fence line but not crossing it, standing there in the headlights for what felt like a long time but was probably 30 seconds. Then something thrown underhand into the yard. The figure got back in. The vehicle reversed and drove away. Clara stood at the window until the sound of the engine had fully faded. Then she took the hatchet from beside the door and went out. It was in the dirt of the yard, 6 feet inside the fence line, a cross made from 2 pieces of fence post lashed together with barbed wire. Not large, not elaborately made, just clear. She crouched and looked at it without touching it for a long moment. Then she picked it up and stood and held it. She had lived in West Texas long enough to understand the specific vocabulary of intimidation in isolated places, the language of warning that didn't require words, that left no fingerprints, that communicated in the register of things that could always be called misunderstanding if it came to that. She threw it into the brush beyond the fence line. She went back inside. She sat in the dark on the edge of her sleeping mat with the hatchet across her knees, and she did not sleep again until the sky began to lighten in the east. Jessie arrived the next morning and knew immediately that something had happened. He read it in her face the way children who have learned to be observant read faces quickly and accurately, she told him. He went still in the particular way he went still when something confirmed a fear he had already been carrying. Then he said that's what he did to the Watkins family 2 years ago. Warren Watkins had 40 acres east of Dolan's main property. He got the cross thing, then his truck tires got slashed, then his irrigation pump got damaged, and then there was a fire in his storage barn. He sold after the barn. Clara looked at him. He met her eyes. My dad told me about it, he said. Before. Before she noted without asking what before meant yet. She had been holding the questions about Leland Pruitt, carefully waiting for the right time, the way you wait for ground to dry before you try to work it. I'm not the Watkins family, she said. I know, Jesse said, but he doesn't know that yet. He picked up the trowel from the ground and went back to work, and she watched him and thought about what it meant that an 11-year-old boy could speak about systematic intimidation with the matter-of-fact accuracy of someone who had been paying attention to the world's mechanics for longer than he should have had to. She went to Edna's the following Saturday, and on the walk she let herself feel what she had not been allowing herself to feel, which was fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of the headlights and the figure at the fence. That kind of fear was almost useful. It sharpened everything, put her body on alert. This was the slower kind. The kind that whispers at 4 in the morning about all the ways things can go wrong, all the ways a single woman with no resources and no connections can lose a fight against a man with money and patience and a long track record of winning. She walked through it, she let it move through her and kept walking. By the time she reached Edna's gate, she had not solved anything, but she had put the fear in its proper place, which was behind her, where it could urge her forward instead of rooting her to the spot. She told Edna about the cross. Edna's hands went still on the edge of her raised bed. She looked at the soil in front of her for a moment, then she said, I was afraid of that. They sat on Edna's porch and drank coffee and talked about options which were limited and practicalities which were difficult, and the specific challenge of being a woman alone on an isolated property facing pressure from a man accustomed to applying it without consequence. And then Edna said, You're not alone, Clara. She said it simply without flourish, the way she said most things. And she meant it practically, not sentimentally, which was exactly what Clara needed. The following Tuesday, Edna came to the Thorn Acre. She brought 2 women with her from town, Beverly Oaks, a quiet woman in her 60s with hands like leather, and a capacity for physical labor that put people half her age to shame, and Patrice Denning, who was younger, perhaps 45, who had been farming a small property outside Crockett for 15 years and who arrived with a truck bed full of seedlings, pepper plants, cabbage starts, 3 varieties of lettuce, which she handed over without ceremony. The soil needed fertility, Patrice said, by way of greeting, looking at the garden. She walked through it with her eyes moving over everything. She said, I've got chicken compost I can bring. The earth's been compacted too long, it needs feeding. Beverly walked the fence line and came back and said, The northeastern section is the weakest. That's where they'd come if they came at night. I can ask my neighbor's boy to walk it a few nights a week. He's 17 and he's got a dog. Clara stood in her garden and looked at these women and felt something break open in her chest in a way that was not painful. She was not accustomed to being helped, not in the way this was, which was practical and specific and given without debt attached. She could not speak for a moment. Edna looked at her and nodded once, which was enough. They worked all day. The garden expanded. New rows were cleared and turned and composted and planted. By late afternoon, what had been a promising start was beginning to look like something that had weight and permanence to it, something that might be there next year and the year after, something that deserved to last. The fire came 17 days later. Clara awoke to the smell of smoke before she was fully conscious, and her body was already moving off the sleeping mat across the room out the door before she had fully processed what she was waking to. The eastern section of the garden was burning. Not the whole garden, not yet, but the corn rows had caught and the fire was moving west. In the pre-dawn wind, with the light, quick movement of fire in dry country, that eagerness, that lateral spread that seems almost personal. She ran to the spring filled. The 2 largest buckets she owned ran back. The fire was faster than the buckets. She ran again and again. Her lungs were burning with the smoke and her arms were seizing with the weight of the water, and the heat on her face was intense enough to make her squint and turn her head to the side as she poured. She was not going to beat it alone. She kept trying anyway. She was on her 6th run from the spring when she heard the fence rattle and Jesse came through at a run with Lily behind him, and Jesse did not stop to ask anything. He went straight for the second set of buckets and joined the relay, and the three of them ran back and forth in the smoke-dark dawn until the fire ran out of fuel at the edge of the cleared section and died to a smolder. When it was over, Clara sat down in the dirt. The corn was gone, all of it. The 2 eastern bean rows were gone. A section of the squash border nearest the corn had burned down to stems. Months of work reduced to a blackened patch of earth that smoked thinly in the morning air, and the smell of it was thick in her throat and on her clothes and in her hair. She sat and looked at it. Jessie sat beside her. Lily stood a few feet away, her small face unreadable, looking at the burned section with an expression that was not a child's expression. The thing Clara felt in that moment was not anger. It came later. What she felt first was a specific kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the physical effort of the past hour, an exhaustion of the will, the particular tiredness that comes when you have been fighting for a long time and the ground you've gained keeps being taken back. Maybe, said a voice in the back of her mind, quiet, reasonable, persuasive. Maybe this is what everyone was telling you from the beginning. She sat with that voice. She let it speak. She did not immediately answer it. Jesse got up. He walked into the burned section. She watched him move through the blackened earth without speaking, crouching, occasionally hands moving through the soil. He was there for perhaps 4 minutes. Then he came back to where she was sitting and crouched in front of her and opened his hands. In his palms were 3 small plants. Corn seedlings, their lower stems blackened but their roots intact, pulled from the edge of the burn zone where the fire hadn't gone deep enough to kill the root system. They were damaged. They were small, but they were alive. These ones made it, Jesse said. He looked at her directly with the eyes that were his grandfather's eyes, steady and clear. We can replant from the edges out, move the rows, put them where the fire didn't go. He said it the way someone states a practical next step. Not inspiration, not consolation, just the next thing. Clara looked at the seedlings in his hands. She looked at the boy holding them. Something shifted in her chest. The despair that had been settling there moved, cracked, and what came through the crack was not hope exactly, but the precursor to hope, the thing that comes before you're willing to call it hope. She got up. She took the seedlings from his hands. Let's start in the northwest corner, she said. The soil's better there anyway. They worked through the morning. By midday, Edna had arrived with Beverly and Patrice brought more seedlings, and Beverly brought compost. And nobody said much about how the fire had started, because they all understood how the fire had started, but they also understood that saying it plainly did nothing useful at this particular moment. The important thing was the work. They worked until the sun was too high and too hot, and then they sat in the thin shade of the house and drank water, and Edna made coffee on the propane burner she had brought, and they drank that too. These things happened, Beverly said, which in context meant the opposite of what the word said. It meant we know what this is, and we're still here. Patrice said, I'll arrange the watch rotation. Different person each night. My neighbor has a motion-sensitive light he can loan. Edna looked at Clara. You didn't flinch, she said. Clara thought about the voice in her head while she was sitting in the ash. She thought about how reasonable it had sounded. I almost did, she said. Edna nodded. Almost doesn't count, she said. 10 days after the fire, Frank Dolan sent the surveyors. Clara was at the spring working on the irrigation channel when she heard the engine on the far side of the property in the northeast section. She stood up and listened. Then she heard the metal sound of something being driven into the ground. She walked the length of the property to the northeastern corner. 3 men were there. 2 she didn't recognize. The third she had seen once before, Frank's younger man, the one who had held her gaze too long at the fence line. He was watching the other 2 work. They had equipment, a surveyor's rod and level, and they were moving along a line she didn't recognize, driving small orange flagged stakes into the ground "What are you doing?" Clara said. The younger man turned. He had a folded document in his hand and he held it out with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for this moment. She took it. It was a survey document, stamped, signed, dated 6 weeks earlier, bearing what appeared to be county seals. According to the boundary coordinates detailed in the document, the legal northeastern boundary of the Sutton property, her property sat approximately 14 feet further southwest than the existing fence line. The practical effect of this adjustment shown on the attached map was that the spring, the granite rock formation, and approximately 12 acres of the most productive section of her land fell outside her legal boundary and within the adjacent property. Frank Dolan's adjacent property. She read it twice. "That's not the correct boundary," she said. The younger man shrugged in a way that suggested he had expected exactly this response. "It's what the survey says," he said. "We're just marking the line." "This survey is false," she said. He smiled briefly without warmth. "Be careful saying that," he said. "Accusations like that are serious." The two surveyors continued working. Clara stood with the document in her hand and looked at the stakes going into her ground and felt the specific quality of helplessness that comes from watching something wrong happen in the language of legitimate process, the stamps, the signatures, the equipment, the professional manner, all the apparatus of legality being used to accomplish something that was not legal at all. She was alone. Jessie had not come yet. That morning, the younger man was watching her. She looked at him steadily. She looked at the stakes. She looked at the document. "Leave the property," she said. He looked amused. "Which property?" he said. She held his gaze and said nothing. After a moment, he nodded at the two surveyors, and they gathered their equipment and moved further along the line. They were marking deeper into the section of ground they were claiming, not leaving, continuing. Clara turned and walked back to the house. She sat at the table she had built from scavenged wood, and she put the document in front of her and she breathed. She was a woman alone on a dirt road with no car, no attorney, no money for one, no family, no connections in this county or any county. Frank Dolan had the equipment and the stamps and the document and 3 men on her property right now driving stakes into her ground. She breathed. Then she picked up her phone and called Edna. That night the phone rang at 11:30. She had been awake, lying in the dark, listening to the sounds of the property, with the specific alertness that had become her normal resting state, hearing Beverly's neighbor's motion light click on once and then off again as something moved through the brush outside. She answered. The voice on the line was female and old. Very old, with the specific quality of age that makes a voice sound like it comes from farther away than the phone suggests, like it is traveling some additional distance to reach you. "You don't know me," the voice said, "but I know what you're sitting on out there." Clara sat up. "Who is this?" she said. The voice said, "Go up the creek until the water stops. You'll know where. There's a chapel up there, an old one. Henry left something in it a long time ago. Not just for you, for the boy too." Clara said, "How do you know about—" "There's a document in that chapel that changes everything," the voice said. "It was put there because it was the only place they couldn't reach. Henry knew they'd come eventually. He made sure there was something they couldn't take." Clara said, "Who are you?" The line went quiet for a moment. "Then someone who waited too long to do what you're doing. Don't make the same mistake." The line went dead. She sat in the dark with the phone in her hand. She tried calling the number back immediately. 3 rings, then nothing, not voicemail, not a disconnection message, just silence, and then the tone of a line that had no intention of answering. She tried again an hour later, the same. She looked at the number in her call log for a long time, memorizing it without knowing why, the way you hold on to something you can't explain. She did not know who the woman was. She thought about it the way you think about something that refuses to resolve, turning it over, finding no new surfaces. In the days that followed, she asked Edna quietly whether she knew of any older woman connected to the Pruitt family, anyone who might have known Henry in his later years. Edna thought about it and said she didn't know Henry to have had sisters, but that Henry had been a private man and there was plenty she might not know. Clara let the question rest without an answer. Some things are given to you whole, and some things are given to you in pieces, and the piece she had been given was this: the creek, the chapel, something Henry left. That was enough. The wind moved through the brush, and the spring moved through its channel in the northeast corner of the land, and the stars overhead were enormous and unmoving. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the survey stakes in the northeastern corner of her property, driven into the ground above the spring that Henry Pruitt had told her 38 years ago on paper was still alive. She did not sleep. The lawsuit arrived on a Thursday. Shelby Greer, the rancher who sometimes drove past Route 9, brought it out in his truck along with a bag of groceries Edna had sent, coffee, dried beans, 2 dozen eggs from her hands. He handed her the legal envelope with the same lack of ceremony he applied to the groceries, and she appreciated that. She read it at the table. Frank Dolan had filed on 2 grounds. First, a challenge to the Sutton Estates' right to deed the property at all, arguing that the original title was irregular. Second, a formal boundary dispute incorporating the fraudulent survey, seeking legal recognition of the adjusted boundary line that would strip her of the spring and the 12 most productive acres. He had an attorney. The filing was thorough. It had the look of something prepared over time, not recently something waiting in a drawer for the right moment. She set the document on the table. She looked out the window at the garden, which had grown back from the fire with a stubbornness that still surprised her, the replanted rows filling in the squash, recovered and spreading again, the pepper plants Patrice had brought standing in neat lines along the southern edge. She looked at all of it, then she looked at the lawsuit, then she got up and went to find Jesse because there were things she had been waiting to say to him, questions she had been waiting to ask, and the ground was dry enough now. She found him near the bean trellis, tying new growth to the wire with strips of cloth. She sat on the rock she kept near the trellis for exactly this purpose, the sitting and thinking rock as Lily had named it, and she said, "Jesse, tell me about your father." He went still. He kept his hands on the wire. She waited. He said, "His name is Leland. He lives in town. He's having a hard time," she said, with what Jesse said, with a lot of things. "After my mom died," he paused, "he owes Frank Dolan money. A lot of it. Loans he took out when things were bad." He looked at his hands on the wire. "Frank's been saying he'll forgive the debt if my dad signs some papers." "What kind of papers?" Clara said. Jessie was quiet for a moment. "Papers giving up any claim the Pruitt family might have to the land out here. Like any legal claim, historical claim." He said it flatly, with the flatness of someone who has understood more than they should have had to understand. "If my dad signs those, whatever my grandpa left, whatever rights the family had, it disappears." Clara looked at him. "Has your father signed them yet?" Jesse shook his head. "But he's close. Frank keeps coming by." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the phone call. She thought about the chapel. She thought about a document that changes everything, put somewhere they couldn't reach. She said, "Jesse, do you know anything about a chapel up the creek above where the spring comes out?" He looked at her then. Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly, but recognition, the look of someone hearing a word they had forgotten and suddenly remembering its meaning. "My grandpa mentioned it once," he said, "when I was little, before he got sick. He said there was an old church up in the rocks." He said he stopped. What Clara said, he said he told me if things ever went bad, the answer was in the chapel. I thought he was talking about God. He looked at her. Was he not talking about God? Clara looked at the garden around them, at the land that had been his grandfather's land and his great-grandfather's land before that, at the spring in the northeastern corner that was feeding all of it, at the survey stakes still standing in the ground where Frank Dolan's men had put them. "Maybe both," she said. She stood up. She looked at the creek line running along the northeastern edge of the property, following it with her eyes to where it disappeared into the rise of the land beyond, up into the rocky higher ground where the brush grew thicker and the trees grew older, and whatever was up there had been undisturbed long enough to forget it existed. Tomorrow, she said. I'm going up. Jessie said, I'll come. She shook her head. She thought about what the voice had said, not just for you, for the boy too. And she thought about what that might mean and decided she needed to know what was up there before she brought Jessie into it. Alone, she said, I need to go alone first. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded with the particular trust of someone who has decided a person is worth trusting and acts on that decision without reservation. She went back to the house. That night, the banked clouds that had been building from the southwest for 3 days finally broke, and the rain came in hard drumming on the repaired roof with a force that tested every seam. She lay in the dark and listened to it and felt the land drinking and thought about what was waiting in the rocks above the spring and whether it would change what she knew or what she could prove, or both. By morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was the particular washed, clean blue of Texas after a storm. The ground steamed lightly in the early sun, and the spring, she could tell before she even got to it, was running stronger. She could hear it. She laced her boots, she picked up the hatchet, she looked at the far end of the property where the land rose and the creek disappeared into the rocks. She went. The creek was running faster than she had ever seen it. The overnight rain had pushed water down through the rock formations above, and the narrow channel that normally moved with the quiet persistence of something doing its work without announcement was now a confident, purposeful current, clear and cold, cutting through the red clay banks with a sound that carried ahead of her as she climbed. Clara followed it north and upward. The land changed as she moved away from the flat acreage of the property. The hot pan gave way to rocky soil, then to outcroppings of limestone and granite that pushed up through the earth at angles, gray and ancient, lichened on their north faces where moisture lingered. The brush grew denser here, cedar and live oak, replacing the open scrub of the lower land, and the air was different too, cooler, holding the night's rain in the shade of the canopy, smelling of wet stone and the specific green smell of things that had been dry a long time and were now drinking. She used the hatchet where the brush closed across what might have once been a path and might have been nothing at all, a deer trail, a runoff channel, the ghost of something human that had not been walked in decades. The going was slow. Her boots found purchase on the wet rock and lost it and found it again. She climbed with one hand, sometimes on the larger stones, pulling herself up the steeper sections, and the creek followed her, or she followed the creek, the distinction becoming less clear as they wound together up the hillside. She had been climbing for nearly an hour when the creek stopped, not dried up, stopped. The water simply disappeared into a crevice at the base of a large granite formation, sinking back into the earth the way it had emerged on the lower property, quietly and without ceremony, as if going somewhere it preferred not to discuss. The sound of it died, and the hillside above was suddenly very still. Clara stood and caught her breath. She looked up. The formation in front of her was larger than anything else on the hillside, a mass of granite, perhaps 30 feet high, split along its face by decades of freeze and thaw into sections that leaned against each other at angles, the crevices between them filled with cedar growth and the accumulated debris of many seasons. Moss covered the lower portions in a continuous dark green. Vines had colonized the upper sections, running across the stone face in patterns that looked almost deliberate. She almost missed it. She was scanning the formation for a way through or around when something in the pattern of the vines resolved itself into something that was not natural. A straight line, then another, the right angle that vegetation does not make on its own, the geometry of human intention showing through decades of organic obscurement. She moved forward through the cedar scrub. The wall emerged from the green as she pushed the branches aside. Fitted stone, not natural formations set by hand in a pattern of deliberate courses, the mortar long since crumbled from most of the joints, but the stones themselves still holding by weight and patience. The wall was perhaps 8 feet high at its tallest point and ran in a rough rectangle, perhaps 20 feet by 15, a building. She moved around its perimeter, pushing through the growth until she found the eastern face, and in the eastern face, an opening where a door had once been. The door itself was long gone. What remained was the stone frame still standing, and beyond it the darkness of the interior, which smelled of cold stone and old earth and time. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the small flashlight she had brought. She clicked it on. She stepped through. The interior was surprisingly intact. The roof had partially collapsed at the western end. A section of the original timber structure had come down at some point, perhaps decades ago, bringing a portion of the stone with it, and through the gap the sky was visible, a rectangle of washed blue. But the eastern two-thirds of the building stood, the walls solid, the space beneath them shadowed and still. The floor was stony, irregular, flags of limestone, many of them heaved up by root growth over the years, but stone. At the far end, what had once been an altar table lay on its side, a simple slab of the same limestone as the floor, still bearing the ghost of a carved cross on its face, worn almost to nothing. Beside it, the remains of a wooden cross that had once stood behind the altar lay on the floor, the upright portion still recognizable, the crossbeam collapsed away. On the eastern wall, faded nearly to invisibility, but still traceable if you knew to look, were the remains of painted letters. Clara moved her light across them, slowly piecing together the words from the fragments that remained. Spring of Grace Chapel, and below that smaller est, 1889. She stood in the silence of the old building and felt the weight of it, not oppressively but substantially, the way you feel the weight of something that has been standing for a long time and intends to keep standing. 135 years of West Texas weather had not brought it down. The vines and the cedar and the collapse of the roof had not taken the walls. Whatever was here had stayed. She moved her light along the walls methodically. In the northeastern corner of the interior, partly hidden by a cedar branch that had pushed through a crack in the wall over the years, she found it. A niche, approximately 18 inches wide and 12 inches high, cut deliberately into the stone of the wall at about chest height, with a fitted stone cover that had been mortared in place at some point. And then more recently, the mortar was lighter in color, more recent in its composition, resealed. More recently meant within the last few decades. Clara set the flashlight on the fallen altar stone angle toward the niche and went to work on the cover with the flat of the hatchet blade working around the seam, carefully trying to break the mortar without breaking the stone. It took her 20 minutes. The cover was heavier than it looked when it finally came loose, and she lowered it to the ground rather than letting it drop. She picked up the flashlight. She looked into the niche. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job, the contents dry despite everything, were 2 items. She lifted them out and carried them to the altar stone and unwrapped them in the light. The first was a document, multiple pages, handwritten in a formal script that belonged to a specific historical era, the kind of careful, deliberate penmanship that people used when they understood that what they were writing was meant to last. The paper was foxed with age and brittle at the edges, but intact, preserved by the oilcloth and the dry Texas climate and the stone walls of a building that had refused to fall down. She read it slowly, carefully parsing the archaic phrasing and the formal legal language of another century. It was a land-grant document dated 1889, signed by a county judge whose name she didn't recognize and witnessed by 4 individuals, one of whom bore the surname Pruitt. The document granted 40 acres described in boundary terms that matched, as far as she could determine, the property she was standing above to a specific and unusual condition of ownership. The land was granted not to an individual or a family name, but to a stewardship. The precise language translated from its 19th century formality said that the land belonged to whoever worked it in good faith, maintained the water source, and kept the chapel. The grant explicitly stated that the land could not be transferred by sale or deed in a manner that displaced an active steward, and that any transfer accomplished by coercion, fraud, or financial pressure applied to a steward in distress was void under the terms of the original grant. Clara read that paragraph 3 times. She sat down on the stone floor. Any transfer accomplished by coercion, fraud, or financial pressure applied to a steward in distress was void. Earl Sutton had obtained this land from Henry Pruitt in 2001. She did not yet know the details of how, but she knew from the letter in her jacket and from Jesse's careful, insufficient words about his father that it had not been a willing sale. And the document in her hand said that such a transfer, whatever its technical paperwork, was legally void under the original terms of grant. She looked at the second item from the niche. It was a journal, composition notebook, the black and white marbled kind, filled from front to back in handwriting. She recognized the same careful cursive as the letter in the tin box. Older now, the hand less steady, the pressure of the pen less consistent. Henry Pruitt's handwriting. She opened it to the first page. He had dated it 2001, January. She read for a long time in the ruined chapel while the morning moved overhead and the light through the collapsed roof section shifted as the sun tracked westward. Henry Pruitt had been 63 years old in 2001. He had farmed the Thorn Acre for 37 years since his father had passed the land to him in 1964. His wife had died in 1998. His son Leland was 35, struggling, not farming, living in town. The property had fallen into debt. Henry wrote about this without self-pity, with a flat accounting of a mentally in damage he understands he is partly responsible for. Earl Sutton had come to him in the spring of 2001. Henry wrote about it over several entries, the way events unfold before you understand what they are. Earl had positioned himself initially as a friend, a neighbor interested in the land's history, someone who had capital and might be willing to help restructure the debt. He had been patient. He had been friendly. Over several months, he had made himself useful in small ways, paying for repairs, covering a property tax payment that Henry couldn't make, lending equipment. Then the terms had changed, not dramatically, not all at once. That was what Henry wrote about with the most precision, how gradual it was, how each step seemed almost reasonable in isolation, how by the time he understood what was happening, he was already deep enough in obligation that the exit was controlled. Earl Sutton had acquired the deed through a series of financial maneuvers that Henry described with careful, specific detail, dates, amounts, the names of the county officials involved in processing the paperwork, the attorney who had drawn up the documents. All of it written in the composition notebook with the thoroughness of a man who understood he was creating a record that might someday need to be read by someone else. At the end of the journal, in an entry dated December 2001, Henry had written, "I know what the chapel holds. I know what the grant says. I am too old and too tired and too far in to fight this the way it needs to be fought, but I have put the document and this notebook where they will be safe. Leland cannot keep it safe. They will find it, but they won't find the chapel. They never walk the land far enough to know it's there. If someone comes who is willing to fight, and someone will. The land has always found its people. Let them find what I've left. Let them use it. The spring is still alive. Don't let them have it." The last line was the same as what he had written in the note pressed into her hand in Hartwell's office 8 years after Henry Pruitt had died. Clara closed the journal. She sat in the chapel with the document and the journal in her lap and let herself feel fully and without management everything she had been carrying since the day in the lawyer's office when her name had appeared at the end of a list as a punch line. She felt the grief of the years in that house, the exhaustion of invisibility, the specific pain of realizing that the man she had spent 19 years with had built something in her name, their marriage, their life, the story she had told herself about who he was on the foundation of something taken by force from an old man who had farmed the same ground for 37 years. She felt the anger of that. She sat with it. Then she put the oilcloth carefully back around the documents, tucked them inside her jacket against her body, and stood up. She looked at the chapel around her, the walls that had stood for 135 years, the altar stone on its side, the painted letters fading on the eastern wall. "Thank you," she said. She didn't know exactly who she was saying it to. She said it anyway. She walked back down the hillside toward her land. She did not tell Jessie that day. She needed to think first, needed to understand what she had and what it meant before she put it in front of a child who was already carrying more than his share. Instead, she called Edna from the front step that evening and told her everything. Edna was quiet for a long time after Clara finished. Then she said, "Walter Greer." Clara said, "Who is that?" Edna said he's been retired for 12 years. He was a land use attorney before that, practiced in this county for 30 years. He knows the history of the water rights out this way better than anyone alive. He lives on Mesquite Street in town Blue Door. He doesn't take cases anymore. Clara said, but he might look at a document. Edna said he might look at a document if the document is what you're saying it is. Yes, she paused. "Clara," she said, "if this holds up legally, historically, it doesn't just protect your land. It puts Earl Sutton's family in a very difficult position. The estate. Virginia. Everything they took from Henry Pruitt." Clara said, "I know. Are you prepared for that?" Clara thought about the floral wallpaper room. She thought about Virginia's hands on her wrist and the envelope lifted away. She thought about 19 years of Sunday dinners and the accumulated weight of being the person in the room that everyone looked slightly past. She thought about Henry Pruitt, 63 years old, watching Earl Sutton take his land entry by patient entry, one reasonable seeming step at a time. "I'm prepared," she said. Walter Greer answered the door in reading glasses and a cardigan that had been washed too many times and was better for it. He was 74 years old, compact and unhurried, with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades listening carefully and have learned that most things become clearer if you wait long enough. He looked at Clara on his doorstep. "Edna called me," he said. "Come in." His house was organized around books and paper, not cluttered but dense, the density of a working mind that had not stopped working just because the practice had closed. He made coffee without asking whether she wanted it, which she appreciated, and they sat at his kitchen table and she put the oilcloth package on the table between them. He unwrapped it with the care of someone who understood what old documents required. He read the land grant first, slowly going back to certain passages multiple times, his reading glasses pushed up to the bridge of his nose, occasionally making a small sound that was not quite a word. Then he read the journal, taking his time, not skimming. Clara sat across from him and drank her coffee and waited. He finished. He took off his glasses. He looked at the document for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "The grant is real. The county seal is Travis County, 1889. I know what those look like. I've worked with land grants from that era before. The stewardship clause is unusual but not unprecedented. There was a period in the late 19th century when certain land transfers in this region were made with conditions attached, particularly around water sources. Courts have upheld similar clauses when the documentation is authentic." Clara said, "Is the documentation authentic?" He picked up the journal. He said the journal is a private record which gives it less formal weight, but the specificity of it, dates, names, amounts, the county officials, that kind of detail can be verified. If even a fraction of what Henry Pruitt wrote here checks out against county records from 2001, it establishes a pattern of fraudulent transfer. He set the journal down. He looked at her. He said, "This doesn't just protect your right to the land, Clara. Combined with the journal, it potentially exposes the Sutton estate to a civil claim by the Pruitt family. Leland Pruitt and his children would have standing to pursue that." Clara said, "I know." He said, "You understand that means implicating your husband publicly in a county where his family has standing." Clara said, "Earl is dead. The truth is still true." Walter looked at her for a long moment with the steadiness of someone deciding something. Then he said, "The survey Frank Dolan filed is fraudulent. I can see that without even pulling the original boundary records. The coordinates in his document don't match the historical plat maps of this area. That part is straightforward. The harder argument is the stewardship clause because it's old and unusual and Frank's attorneys are going to attack its validity." He put his glasses back on. "But it's real," he said, "and in my experience, real tends to hold." He looked at the document one more time. "How soon can you bring me the boy's father?" he said. She went to Leland Pruitt on a Tuesday morning. Jessie had given her the address without asking why, in the way he had given her most things directly without requiring explanation. Clara drove into Crockett in Garrett Oaks' truck, which he had offered without her having to ask more than once. Leland Pruitt lived in a rental house on the eastern edge of town, a small frame house with a chain-link fence and a yard that had been let go. He answered the door. On the third knock, a man of 38 who looked a decade older, carrying the specific physical evidence of grief and its numbing agents, the eyes that weren't quite tracking all the way, the posture of someone who had been holding themselves up through will alone for long enough that the will was fraying. He looked at her. He said, "You're the woman on Henry's land." She said, "Yes, I need to talk to you. It's about Jessie and Lily. It's about what your father left." He looked at her for a long time. Something moved in his face, an emotion she couldn't name, or perhaps several, moving through in sequence too quickly to identify individually. He opened the door wider. He said, "Come in." She told him everything. The journal, the chapel, the grant document, what Walter Greer had said, what it meant for the family's legal standing. She told him plainly and without ornament, the way you tell someone something important that they need to understand completely, not the way you tell a story. He listened. He sat across from her at a kitchen table that had dishes on it and unopened mail, the accumulated surfaces of a man living alone without much energy for management. And he listened with increasing stillness, the way people go still when they are receiving information that is rearranging something fundamental. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He said, "Henry tried to tell me, after it happened, he said there was something he had put away, something that would matter someday. I thought he meant he stopped. I thought he was sick and confused. He'd been sick for a while by then." Clara said he wasn't confused. Leland looked at his hands on the table. He said, "Frank Dolan has been to see me 4 times in the last 2 months. The debt is real. I made mistakes. He has the paperwork. He said if I sign the quit claim, he'll clear the debt and I can..." He stopped again. "I almost signed it last week," Clara said, "but you didn't." He said, "Jessie asked me not to." He said he had a feeling. Clara looked at this man who had lost his mother and then his father and then his footing, who was sitting in a kitchen with unopened mail on the table and debt he couldn't pay, and a son who had more faith in him than he had earned lately, and she thought about what it costs to ask someone to be better than they currently are, and whether it was fair to ask that. She decided it was necessary, which wasn't the same as fair, but sometimes had to serve the same function. She said, "Leland, I need you to come to court. I need you to tell a judge what happened in 2001, what you saw, what you knew. I need you to be Jessie's father in that courtroom." He looked at her. She said, I know that's a lot to ask. I know you're not in a good place. But Walter Greer thinks your testimony, combined with the journal, combined with the grant, gives us enough. Without you, it's harder. With you, it's real. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a car passed on the street. A dog barked somewhere. The kitchen clock made its small sound. He said, what happens to the debt if we do this? She said, Walter thinks a successful case changes the picture considerably. But I won't lie to you, I don't know exactly. I know that if you sign Frank's paper, it disappears as an argument forever. I know Henry spent the last 20 years of his life making sure there was a path out of this, if someone was willing to walk it. Leland Pruitt looked at the table, he looked at the wall, he looked somewhere that wasn't in the room. Then he said, tell me what Walter needs me to say. The hearing was set for a Thursday in November. The weeks between that Tuesday in Leland's kitchen and the day in court were the hardest of all the hard weeks Clara had lived on the Thorn Acre. Harder in some ways than the weeks with no water and the fire and the survey stakes and the cross in the yard, because this waiting was different from those ordeals. Those had required action, and action was something she knew how to meet. This required patience, and patience was always harder. She kept working, she kept planting. She repaired the last section of the fence and restrung it with new wire. She built a proper cover for the spring from cedar posts and corrugated tin to protect it from debris. She expanded the western growing area, cleared 3 new rows, planted garlic and onion sets for spring. She kept moving because motion was what kept the fear from settling into conviction. Jessie worked beside her, and she told him finally fully what she had found in the chapel and what it meant. He listened the way he always listened, completely and without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my grandfather left that for whoever came. Yes, Clara said, he thought about this. He said he left it for you. She said he left it for the land. Jessie looked at the property around them, the garden, the spring, the repaired fence, the house with its new roof and its door that opened and closed properly. Same thing, he said. She looked at him. She thought about the morning he had come through the fence with a rusted piece of wire and offered to help without explanation. She thought about his hands opening in front of her with the burned seedlings inside, his voice saying, these ones made it. She thought about what it means when a child decides to trust you and the weight of that decision and what you owe it. Same thing, she agreed. The morning of the hearing, she was up before the sun. She dressed carefully in the clothes Edna had brought her, a dark blouse, pressed slacks, boots that had been cleaned of the property's red clay. She looked at herself in the small mirror she had hung on the back of the bedroom door and saw a woman who was 45 years old and had lived outdoors for 4 months and whose hands showed every hour of it. She looked fine. She looked like herself. Garrett Oaks drove her and Edna into town. Leland Pruitt met them at the courthouse steps, Jessie and Lily beside him. Jessie in a collared shirt that was slightly too large in the shoulders and Lily in a dress Clara hadn't seen before. Leland had shaved. He was standing straighter than she had seen him stand. He met her eyes. She nodded. Walter Greer was already inside. Frank Dolan arrived with his attorney and 2 men in suits who were either witnesses or advisors or both. Frank wore a good jacket and his rancher's hat, and his expression was the expression Clara had first seen at the fence line, the controlled assessment of a man surveying what he considers his territory. He looked at Clara. She met his eyes and held them. The hearing began. Frank's attorney was thorough. He challenged the validity of the 1889 document on grounds of age and obscurity, arguing that a conditional stewardship clause from the post-Reconstruction era could not override a century of subsequent legal transfer. He presented the fraudulent survey as if it were simply a correction of long-standing boundary error. He questioned Clara's standing, her residency history, her relationship to the land's history. Walter let him finish. Then he presented the grant document with documentation of the county seals, authenticity cross-reference against county land records from 1889 that he had obtained from the state archive. He presented Henry Pruitt's journal and the specific verifiable details. Within it, 3 of the names Henry had recorded had been confirmed through county records as officials who had indeed processed land transactions in 2001. Then he called Leland Pruitt. Leland walked to the witness position and sat down, and Clara watched him from across the room. His hands were on the arms of the chair, and his jaw was set in a way that was his son's jaw, the same line, the same control, tension. He told the truth. He told it plainly, without embellishment, the way someone tells a thing they have been carrying for a long time and has finally been permitted to set down. He described watching his father's land transfer piece by piece in 2001. He described the financial maneuvers, the loan structures, the county officials who had processed paperwork with a speed that should have required more time. He described the day his father had signed the final document, the specific morning, the specific room, the specific quality of his father's face afterward. He described Henry Pruitt as a man who loved his land. He said it simply without editorializing, and the room was quiet when he said it. Frank Dolan's attorney cross-examined hard. Leland held. Clara watched. Jesse in the row beside Edna watching his father, and saw something happen in the boy's face, not dramatic, not sudden, but visible, a settling, something that had been held at a slight angle for a long time moving to plumb. Walter presented one final item, the original plat map of the property from the county land records, which showed the boundary lines as they had existed since 1889, unchanged through every subsequent transaction, confirming that Frank Dolan's survey was not a correction but an invention. The judge, a woman in her late 50s named Caldwell, who had been taking notes throughout with the focused attention of someone not interested in theater, looked at the documents in front of her for a long time. She asked 3 specific questions of Walter. She asked one question of Frank's attorney, which his attorney answered poorly. Then she announced that she was taking the matter under review and would issue her decision within 30 days. 30 days. Clara walked out of the courthouse into the November sun and stood on the steps and breathed the cool air and let herself feel the uncertainty of 30 days without letting it become more than that. Leland came to stand beside her. He said, "I should have done that a long time ago." She said, "You did it when it needed doing." He looked at the street, at the ordinary Thursday life of Crockett, Texas, moving around them. He said, "Henry would have liked you." She thought about the letter in the tin box, the careful old cursive, the man who had farmed the same ground for 37 years and believed in it past the point where believing was easy. "I think I would have liked him too," she said. The decision came on a Wednesday. Hartwell, the lawyer who had pressed the envelope into her hand in August, called her, which surprised her. He said he was sorry he couldn't do more that day, and she said she understood, and he said the judge's decision had been filed and Walter had a copy. She called Walter. He read her the operative paragraph over the phone in a steady voice that held only the slightest warmth at its edges, the warmth of a man who has been correct about something important and is too professional to celebrate but too human to entirely conceal. The court found the 1889 stewardship grant valid and applicable. The court found the 2001 land transfer accomplished in a manner inconsistent with the grant's protective terms. The court found the boundary survey submitted by the plaintiff to be fraudulent. The court ordered the property, including all water sources, returned to Clara Sutton's sole legal ownership as current steward. The court referred evidence of the fraudulent survey to the county prosecutor's office. The court further noted that the Pruitt family retained standing to pursue a separate civil action regarding the 2001 transfer, a matter outside the scope of the current proceeding. Clara stood in the garden when Walter read it to her, her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand pressed flat against the earth beside the spring channel, feeling the coolness of it through her palm. She thanked him. She stood up. She looked at the land. She heard about Frank Dolan through Edna the following week. He had not spoken publicly. He had not appealed, at least not yet, though his attorney had reserved the right. Edna said he had been seen at the feed store looking the way a man looks when something he was certain of has turned out to be not entirely certain. Then Edna said he asked about you. Clara said, "What do you mean?" She said he asked Roy Hatfield, who knows everyone, whether you were the kind of person who holds grudges. Edna paused. Roy told him he didn't know you well enough to say. Clara thought about this. She thought about a man who had lost his son to a creek in 2014 and had spent 10 years trying to own the thing that had hurt him. She thought about what that grief had made him capable of and what it had cost him, and whether the two things were connected in the way that damage and the damage we do to others are usually connected. She thought about what she would say if he came to her. 3 days later he came. He drove the expensive pickup to the fence line as he had done a dozen times before, but this time he got out and he came to the gate, the proper gate, the gate she had built and hung correctly on new hinges 2 months ago, and he knocked on the post. She went to the gate. They stood on either side of it. He had aged, she thought, in the months since the first time she had seen him. Not dramatically, but visibly, in the way that people age when something they were holding on to turns out not to hold. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands. He said, "I didn't come to argue." She waited. He looked at the garden over her shoulder. He looked at the spring in its clear channel with its cedar post cover. He looked at the corn rows and the squash and the garlic sets in the western section and the pole beans on their trellis. He said, "My boy Thomas used to fish that creek up in the rocks. Before the flood, he said the water up there was the cleanest water in the county." Clara said nothing. She let him have the silence. He said, "I know what I did to you. And to the Pruitts, I know that what I told myself about it, about the water, about Thomas, about what I had a right to, I know that was not the thing." He looked at her. "It was grief. I understand that's not an excuse." Clara looked at this man who was 65 years old and had more money than she would ever have and had used it to drive a woman off her land and falsify legal documents and threaten a family into silence, and who was standing at her gate with his hat in his hands telling her it was grief. She thought about how grief does not excuse things. She had already decided that. She also thought about how grief explains them, which is not the same thing and matters anyway. She said, "Your son loved clean water. You tried to own the thing that took him. I understand what that is." She paused. She said, "I'm sorry for your loss, Frank. I mean that." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that had been held tightly shifted and then steadied, and he looked both older and less burdened at the same time, the way people look when they have been carrying something and it is taken from them without their asking. He put his hat back on. He nodded once. He walked back to the truck and drove away and did not come back. The months that followed moved away. Good seasons moved not slowly, but with a fullness that made each day feel used rather than spent. The civil case proceeded. Walter took it on Leland's behalf pro bono because he said the records were clean and the case was clear, and there were some things a man does at the end of a career because they are right. The Sutton estate settled before it went to hearing. Virginia Sutton did not attend the settlement meeting. Clara was not present either. She had told Walter what she needed and let him represent it, which was that the settlement should benefit Leland and Jessie and Lily directly in the form of a trust, and that she did not want money from it for herself. Edna had looked at her when she told her this and said, "Are you sure?" Clara had said Henry Pruitt's family lost that land before I ever arrived. Whatever comes from setting that right belongs to them. Edna had looked at her for a long time. Then she had said Henry chose right, whoever he was hoping for when he put those seeds in the ground. Leland came to the Thorn Acre for the first time in December. He came on a Saturday, drove out from town, parked on Route 9, and stood at the gate the way his son had stood at the fence the first time looking at the land. Jessie was beside Clara when she saw him there, and she said to the boy, "Go, let your father in." Jessie went to the gate and opened it. Leland walked through. He walked the property slowly with the gait of someone who has been somewhere before and is finding where the memory lives in the body. He walked to the spring and crouched and pressed his hand against the earth the way Clara had done the first time she found it, and he stayed there for a moment with his eyes closed. He stood up. He said quietly, and not particularly to anyone, he was right. The water never left. He worked that afternoon alongside Jessie and Lily and Clara, saying little, learning the rhythms of the work that his son already knew. And by the end of the day, there was nothing to say because everything had been said in the working. Diane Dolan came on a morning in January. She parked on Route 9 and got out and stood at the gate in the specific way of someone who has rehearsed this moment and finds that the rehearsal has not fully prepared them for the actual moment. She was 38 years old, dressed for town rather than for outdoor work, with the look of someone who has recently lost something large and is still deciding what the loss requires of her. Clara went to the gate. The woman said, "I'm Diane Dolan, Frank's daughter-in-law, or former daughter-in-law. My marriage ended in November." She stopped. She said, "I heard about what you did here. I know Frank is and I know what he is. But I grew up in this county and I've been watching what you've built out here and I..." She stopped again. She said, "I don't know anything about farming. I've never grown anything. But I have time and I'm willing to work and I need something to do with my hands that means something." She looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her. She looked at the gate between them. She looked at the land behind her, the winter garden, the dormant beds waiting for spring, the spring itself running clear and cold, doing what it had always done. She unlatched the gate. She opened it. She said, "This is where it starts." Diane Dolan walked through. Spring came early to the Thorn Acre that year. The rains came in March, and the soil, which had been worked and fed and attended through one full growing season, received them the way land receives water when it has been properly prepared, gratefully, completely, without runoff. The creek ran strong through the northeast corner, and the spring filled its channel to its edges, and the ground drank it all. Clara stood in the garden on a morning in late March and looked at what a year had made. 8 rows of spring vegetables, tomato starts under cover waiting for the last frost to pass, the garlic sending up green shoots in the western section, the pole bean trellis rebuilt and waiting, Edna's raised bed, which Edna had built herself in the southwest corner during a visit in February, and which she tended with the focused authority of someone who knows exactly what she's doing. Jesse was at the spring, checking the channel level, the way Clara had taught him, reading the water, the way his grandfather had once read it. Lily was in the garlic rows, moving along them with her careful hands, doing the work that had to be done. Leland was mending the far fence, something he had taken on as his particular task. The fence, the long perimeter, walking it and keeping it sound. Diane was learning to read soil in the east section, crouching with both hands in the earth, asking questions that were the right questions, learning. Clara walked the length of the garden slowly, not working, just looking, just receiving what was there. She thought about a room with floral wallpaper and a window that didn't open all the way. She thought about a lawyer's office in August heat and 14 members of a family arranged at a table and her own name appearing last attached to 40 acres of cracked earth at the end of a road nobody drove. She thought about a tin box under a floor and seeds in cloth pouches, and a man named Henry Pruitt who had believed in this ground for 37 years and had believed in the next person for 30 years after that, believed so specifically and so practically that he had sealed the proof of it in oilcloth in a chapel in the rocks and waited. She looked at the spring, she looked at the garden, she looked at the people moving through it. She thought about what it means to be given a place that nobody wants and to find out that it wanted you. She bent down and pressed her palm flat against the earth. It was warm from the morning sun on its surface and cool below that, the deep cool of ground with water in it, of soil that had been fed and worked and believed in through one full turn of a season. She felt it against her palm. The land doing what it had always done, still alive, still here.